security forces is held closer to the chest in secrecy than many nuclear codes. And I can expand more on this. I've got data if you'd like to hear during the question and answer period. If Western intelligence services are correct in assessing that the Taliban's annual budget is somewhere between 300 and 600 million a year, and I think that's a bit high, that represents about 1/10 of what the United States provides for the Afghan security forces right now. Okay, and a very important and a key indicator to me on how bad the security presently is in Afghanistan is this. This again comes out of the New York Times 2 weeks ago. War data once public, and this is the headline, is now censored by the U.S. military. The American military command in Afghanistan has decided to keep secret key figures related to the growth and progress and local security forces, redacting the numbers at the behest of the Afghan officials from the latest report by the government watchdog, our special investigator, Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. Now, why do you think that's the case? We're now classifying the number of Afghan national security, casualties, numbers under arms, and other data. That's a clear indicator to me that something is very, very wrong. Among the details being kept secret are the number of people in the Afghan army and police force, how many have been wounded or killed, and the state of their equipment. The ANA hasn't met a recruitment goal for years. And they're now recruiting men, as many of you probably know. They changed their recruitment. They're recruiting men in their 50s. And the recruitment is down, the reports are down as much as 50%. But as just mentioned, the exact data on Afghan forces now have been classified by both the United States government and the Afghan government, which largely bankrolls, obviously, the security forces. It's also important to realize that over the last 7 to 8 years, ANA has averaged 33% annual desertion. The situation is so dire. Again, if you've been reading the newspapers in the last couple of weeks, the CIA military force is multiplying their Afghan objectives and are now running operations all over Afghanistan. I think this also could prove to be disastrous for a wide variety of reasons that we might want to address during the question and answer period. The sustainability of Afghan forces remains a challenge in light of high attrition rates, re-enlistment rates, and they remain particularly low, and they need to be increased to compensate for their losses. In 2016 alone, we saw 6,500 Afghan national security forces killed, the worst annual casualty toll since the Americans got involved in the war in 2001. And according to the most recent Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, and despite expenditures of $90 billion to build and sustain the Afghan National Security Forces, the force has terrible logistics and command and control capabilities. So this is a major concern. According to one report, the Helmand, especially the Helmand police, nearly half of the police force in this contentious province doesn't actually exist. The U.S. continues to spend billions of dollars to fund it, but there's ghost soldiers and ghost police all over the country. The Afghan Minister of the Interior is posed to conduct an investigation based on information coming from the former police chief in Helmand concerning ghost police. His replacement has referred to the abuse of power as an act of treason. The Afghan police force has been actively funded by the U.S. to the tune of $15 billion since 2002. When I served as a senior political and counterinsurgency advisor to the Canadian Commanding General Jonathan Vance, Task Force Kandahar, which I served in 2008 and 2009, Kabul was paying, I know this for a fact, Kabul was paying Kandahar for 2,800 police forces. We knew that there were only 1,700 police on the ground. So where's that money going? Kill statistics have now become the new measure of success, just like in Vietnam. Because we're no longer fighting counterinsurgency. We're no longer doing nation building. So you're starting to hear Nicholson talk about body bags, just like Vietnam. But you're never going to kill or capture your way to victory in Afghanistan. The Taliban are energized, and they'll fight for generations. We cannot kill off the Taliban. We have to have a political solution. Moreover, and more importantly, Pakistan has been a duplicit enemy relative to Afghanistan and not an ally. Let's call them what they are. They have indirectly and directly killed my students. In fact, my newest book is dedicated to one of those students. So, you know, I don't consider Pakistan an ally. I consider Pakistan an enemy. I recognize they have very different South Asian goals in the United States, but that doesn't excuse Pakistan from directly and indirectly killing American and NATO forces as well as many Afghan forces. Lastly, we've had a useless information and PSYOP campaign, another real focus of my new book, which I believe is damning because an insurgency is basically an information war trying to win we'd say hearts and minds. That's ridiculous. A foreign power can never win the hearts and minds of another culture. But you try to win the trust and confidence. And if you take a look at the US coin manual as well as the British coin manual, it'll suggest that 90% of a coin battle is informational and 10% is military kinetic or military actions. And we've had absolutely no information Operation Success or PSYOPs since the beginning of the war. One story I'll tell real quickly is I was a keynote speaker at the State Department Annex in 2009 with all the principals and deputy principals of everybody involved in U.S. and IO, information operations and PSYOPs. And at the end of my hour-and-a-half speech, I asked them, I said, tell me the 3 themes that you're going to try to propose to push this next year, recognizing how important this was for our engagement in Afghanistan. And the room went blank. Not one person could answer it. In fact, Peter Thompson, Ambassador Peter Thompson, who writes the preface to my book, tells a similar story. We've had a useless IO and PSYOPs campaign. It's been very damning. Relative to nation building, and it's important to recognize that the United States has spent significantly more money in real dollars in Afghanistan than it did to rebuild Europe after World War II and the Marshall Plan. We spent more money in Afghanistan in real dollars than we spent in the Marshall Plan. And what have we gotten for it? So let me consider just a few statistics of our international aid and presence in Afghanistan. And believe me, I mean, outside of the United States, there's not a country that I love more than Afghanistan. And there's no people I love more than the Afghans. But I'm going to give you some very depressing statistics. In the rural areas, 1 out of 14 Afghan women die during childbirth. Electricity in major cities is still extremely sporadic. You probably read last week that they only had 8 hours of electricity in Afghanistan. And this is after 17 years and hundreds of billions of dollars of spent in aid. We still have 40% unemployment in Afghanistan. Corruption is endemic. Hundreds of millions of dollars have just disappeared. Afghan still remains, there's been changes, but it still remains one of the worst places in the world to be a woman. Lack of drinking water in parts of the country, and a crumbling infrastructure, and I could go on and on. Finally, talking about the present situation, let me just suggest that insurgent jihadist violence is up. The Afghan government is still driven by fractional disputes. I don't believe Ghani likes Abdullah, and I don't think Abdullah likes Ghani. A national unity government is basically a joke. And there's an exceedingly slow process of appointing and confirming ministers, as one of my colleagues suggested earlier. And this is 3 years after the runoff election in 2014. The Afghan army and the police are getting beaten up in the field. Not all, but many. And chunks of rural Afghanistan are either under or administered by anti-government elements. Now let me talk briefly about Trump's Afghan quote plan and his speech that he gave in August concerning it. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes on this. But the one thing that I don't want you to confuse is that this is not a strategy. A strategy has a defined end state, and no end state was ever mentioned by President Trump. So it's a plan. First of all, let's remember that just days before Trump's speech, he was still considering Eric Prince's totally insane idea of privatizing the war at the cost of $10 billion a year. Prince seriously argued for the deployment of 10,000 foreign mercenaries who can't speak the local languages, would wear Afghan uniforms, and drop bombs with his private air force outside of standard rules of conflict. Now, what could possibly go wrong with that scheme? In my opinion, Trump's speech was an incoherent wish list that was unmoored in political reality or principle. While not supporting democracy or human rights, he stated the U.S. demands reform as a condition for its continued assistance. But what reforms? Not one reform was mentioned. They weren't specified. Trump's speech, as all of his speeches do, left many more questions answered, or many more questions than answers. Hence, the cynic Tom Johnson basically says that he gave an empty speech with a new, quote, plan that will make no difference. The cynicism in me says that the major lesson of his speech is, let's not lose this thing while my administration is still in power over the next 6 to 8 months or maybe another year and a half before Mueller spills the beans and I resign or get impeached. Now that's the cynic part of me. I believe it borders on delusional thinking to believe that an additional 3,000 more U.S. troops, raising the Afghan footprint of the United States to 14K, plus maybe 30,000 contractors, but that's highly classified information, is going to make a difference when 152,000 U.S. and NATO troops couldn't get the job done over a 12-year period. There are more, as I said, there are about 14,000 American troops in Afghanistan today, including some who are part of the counterinsurgency mission, and roughly 6,500 forces from NATO and other countries. Most of the unfilled positions would be training U.S. security forces, whose future success is one of the pillars of Trump's new South Asian plan. What did the Afghan forces get over the previous 15 years of training? And the $150 billion that the United States spent. An indicator of how desperate the situation presently is in Afghanistan is that in October, the United States aircraft dropped 653 bombs, the most of any month since 2012. Nobody can win this war through the air. Plus, this plays directly, I would argue, in the Taliban's hand, because the Taliban's military strategy has always been one thing: force the United States and NATO into making mistakes. You know, let a maneuver element chase around a bunch of madrasa students, let them go into a village and just pray that a 500-pounder comes and goes astray and kills an Afghan innocent, a woman or a child. Because the Taliban know that then Kabul, NATO, and the United States has lost that village forever. So I'm very concerned about this significant increase in air sorties. The Taliban, Trump also ignored the main and major issues: a corrupt central government that is extremely dysfunctional, a fairly inept Afghan national security force that is shrinking each month, a disastrous Afghan economy, and rising ethno-linguistic tension in the country, to name but a few. Also significant are blatant inaccuracies made by Trump during his speech. For example, he suggested today U.S.-designated terrorist organizations are active in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the highest concentration in any region anywhere in the world, and that's a quote. Well, he might be correct relative to Pakistan, but relative to Afghanistan, there aren't that many terrorist organizations in the country, okay? Nothing close to what exists in Pakistan. And if Trump really believed what his statement was valid, why aren't Pakistan and Afghanistan on Trump's travel ban list? He also referred to the Prime Minister of Afghanistan. Now, I know this is a touchy subject with some Afghans, but Afghanistan doesn't have a prime minister. Yet, to quote Trump in a speech, he studied Afghanistan up and down and from all angles. Overall, I think the speech basically reflected moving the deck chairs around on the Afghan Titanic. The only solution to this conflict is political, and here his talk was completely vacuous. With all of this said, I did like his statements concerning Pakistan and India. Pakistan, as suggested earlier, has been an extremely unreliable ally in Afghanistan and has long sponsored terrorists, and India could serve as a useful role, especially if Trump finally gets a U.S. ambassador in the country. Pakistan, who has never really been an ally relative to Afghanistan and are responsible, as I suggested earlier, for directly and indirectly killing our servicemen, and for the most part, we've tolerated this. I also like Trump playing the India card. Finally, let me say the speech also failed to address at all the more aggressive interlopers that have been approaching Afghanistan, such as China, Russia, and Iran. While remote but not entirely out of the question, there is still a probability of Afghanistan becoming a venue for a proxy war between some of these countries, if not properly managed, and that could be an absolute disaster. In summary, Trump's slight adjustment will never bring stability to Afghanistan, a country whose history and culture are replete with rebellious people that are unwilling to support a strong central government. America's failure to adjust strategy based on this reality is a principal cause to Afghanistan's instability. To summarize his plan and speech, in military terms, Trump's long-awaited Afghan strategy looks very much like the old one, but on the diplomatic front, he did take a risk in confronting an unruly Pakistan. But then Pakistan could pat him on his back, send a couple of nice tweets, and he might change his position. That's what I'm worried about. I'm totally in favor of turning up the pressure on Pakistan, from cutting military aid to stripping them of allied status or declaring them a state sponsor of terrorism, which they are. But I worry that Trump has a tendency to change, as I mentioned, his mind on a whim. But the biggest stick may be the outreach to India. The United States has always encouraged Indian involvement in Afghanistan, but it has been careful not to step on Pakistan toes. I think this should change. I don't believe the U.S. any longer needs to be careful about Pakistan sensitivity. Now let me turn finally to the question of cross-border, the cross-border question that was the actual question the forum asked me to address. Pakistan and its nefarious role in harboring and providing support and refuge for the Taliban can no longer be tolerated or excused. While we can no longer be silent about Pakistan's safe havens for terrorist organizations, the Taliban, LET, JUD, which they're making an actual political party in the country, the Haqqani network, and a multitude of other groups, many created by Pakistan's ISI. These terrorists will continue to cross the border and wreak havoc. I can't believe, and I'm sure many in the room cannot believe, that Pakistan just last week released under house arrest Hafiz Saeed, who was the mastermind of the Mumbai attack. I just can't believe it. This likely will be the hardest aspect of the strategy to achieve. Both of Trump's immediate predecessors also made overtures to regional approaches to Afghanistan, and neither delivered. Pakistan cannot have it both ways, and the U.S. has a great deal of leverage to use or help if necessary to force Islamabad to change its ways. But we can't solve Afghanistan without Pakistan, and you can't solve Pakistan without India. This ripple effect is a key to achieving a sustainable solution in my mind. As long as groups such as the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Haqqani network find safe haven in Pakistan, and Lord knows they do, and the state supports terrorist proxies, this must stop, and it's time to turn the pressure up a notch. A few more comments concerning Pakistan. Any analysis of Islamabad's strategy hinges on the uncertainty over the patron-client dynamic between Pakistan and the Afghan Taliban. While safe havens in Pakistan have undoubtedly been of great importance to the Afghan Taliban, recent overall support has been much more limited, and mostly limited to attacks on Indian targets conducted by the Haqqanis. And this is about the last year and a half we've seen this. But there's still support, there's still refuge there. Pakistan, and for example, the Pakistan intelligence relationship with the Taliban goes far beyond mere shelter. Credible sources from the Pakistan's frontier tribal areas have told analysts that the leadership of Haqqani, when they were indeed removed out of North Waziristan after the Pakistan army moved in 2014, they just moved to the Tara Valley and the Khyber. And if this is true, this move could not have possibly taken place without the help, or at least acquiescence, of the Pakistan intelligence. Pakistan would greatly benefit from the Taliban in charge of the Afghan government. At a minimum, they would have a friendly government besides its border and a hostile government towards India. Even in the case of Afghan instability, Pakistan's interest is secured given the Pak military's fear of growing Indian influence. Many people in urban areas of Afghanistan increasingly favor India over Pakistan and highly appreciate Indian involvement in Afghanistan. And I know I do, and I think many Americans also do. Pakistani generals and officials believe that India is seeking to undermine Pakistan through Afghanistan, above all through the support of the ethnic separatist movement in Baluchistan, where Pakistan sees RAW behind every rock and every tree. Now, I'm sure there's Indian support, but it's nothing near what Pakistan blames on India. America's ability to put economic pressure on Pakistan might be severely restricted by China's aid. The $46 billion promised in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPAC, and the associated projects is more than 3 times greater than all U.S. non-military aid since 2001. So this is something we also have to ask. The United States won't pay $3 million in military reimbursements to Pakistan after the Pentagon determined the country was not making sufficient action against the U.S.-designed terrorist group. And that's good. At issue are monies from the Coalition Support Fund, CSF, that the United States provides the country to offset the cost they encounter in supporting counter-terrorist operations. And Pakistan, quite frankly, has been the largest recipient of this aid. Pakistan has received roughly $14 billion in reimbursements from this fund since 2002. Finally, let me talk about a couple other security issues and then conclude. Afghan National Security Force sustainability is the key, possibly the key question. I personally believe that if internationals leave at noon, by 1400 hours, the Afghan military would disappear. The biggest complaint about the Afghan National Security Force over the past year is trying to fight without robust air support. Despite what anyone tries to tout about Afghan Air Force, there are still issues seriously considered the effectiveness. Afghan security forces casualties, as I suggested, are way up and they're not sustainable. The Taliban remains strong across the country. There are high-profile attacks in the Afghan capital of Kabul and other cities that indicate their reach and operational abilities. Afghan National Security Forces may be able to secure most population centers while international troops and resources remain committed through 2017, but we'll still likely see control of more rural areas without international funding. In the midst of emerging Daesh presence, the Taliban has continued to pursue its long-term goal of pushing for the withdrawal of international forces from Afghanistan, ousting the Kabul government and reestablishing the Islamic Emirate, even if the Emirate is restricted initially to only a few provinces in southern Afghanistan. I got more to say, but I've taken too much time. So let me just include with some positives. Despite all of the negatives I suggested, you know, there is, in this long slog and bloody insurgency, the Taliban remains a fractious entity, broken between Akhundzada and Mullah Muhammad Rasul. So they have both vertical and lateral lack of coordination that could help. But I think the overall situation will remain bleak unless we make some major strategy changes. And I'll end my talk on that, and thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for a very robust presentation. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions coming out of that. So let me throw it open to the audience, and I will try and be fair and do this and also as quickly as we can. And if you could take that microphone, if you could help me. Yeah. So first of all, there's a gentleman in the second row. Yeah.
My name is Isar. I'm a PhD student at SOAS. My focus is very much on tax and estate building. So I've got 2 questions and a sort of comments for all panelists.
We do have a lot to get through. I mean, 1 per person would be fairer, probably.
Okay. Well, so I'll try to make it shorter then. First of all, on the pessimism that Thompson has shared, I kind of agree on some of it, but there is part of the issue with the international engagement in Afghanistan which has to be blamed for. Aid engagement in Afghanistan, aid and assistance that have been given to Afghanistan was not effective. It was very much focused on security, insurgency, and fighting the terrorism, where in fact less has been made with respect to developing the infrastructure in Afghanistan. We understand from the literature that there is a close ties between insurgency and unemployment or economic chaos. We could see that most of the people who joined the insurgent group is not only because of their ideological belief that they joined them, but also part of the economic chaos that they are experiencing. Daesh is the reason for emergence of Daesh in the east of Afghanistan is one reason. And also the discussion on the regional rivalries again, my point is that it has to be more on economic consensus more than political interest of this region. There are a number of projects that have started long ago: TAPI, Lapis Corridor, CASA 1000, Chabahar, which was discussed a little bit. International engagement has not done enough on that bit of issue that we could, of course, see things way better than.
Yeah, the United States has spent more on development aid in Afghanistan than we did in the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. Now, I agree. The corruption that's been involved with that aid has been terrible. I have seen buildings that we've built that have been based with cement and sand that have literally melted when the rain has come. There's been massive corruption with this development aid. But to suggest that the United States has not given enough aid is just plain wrong. I mean, $150 billion. We could rebuild a major part of the U.S. infrastructure with that money. I mean, more money than we spent in rebuilding Europe? And you can suggest that we haven't given enough international economic aid? I just don't buy it.
But that wasn't on development aid, 150 billion. It was mostly on military side.
No, it wasn't. Go read Seagar. That's economic aid. We've spent in Afghanistan $785 billion.
Look at the national solidarity.
$785 billion we've spent. Now, most of that's military, but we spent significant money on nation building, and all I ask you to do is go to the Seagar site and take a look at the actual aid. It's over $150 billion.
Ambassador, let's just get this off here, and then we'll go to the question.
Well, I guess you understand how politics works in the United States these days. It's tough, it's partisan, but at the same time, there's a lot that is right and a lot that has to be fixed. The numbers, I don't think anyone has the accurate numbers, but the numbers, the closest accurate numbers that we do have in terms of expenditure in Afghanistan is about $115 billion toward Afghan reconstruction and security development. So that includes a big chunk of the money that was spent on the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces that have at least 4 components: the Army, the Air Force, the intelligence services, and etc. Smaller institutions that have been built to help the mission in Afghanistan. So I just wanted to clarify that. But to compare it to I think that comparing it to the Marshall Plan of the 1940s and 50s is not also the best way to do so, because on one hand, we're talking about the different value of the dollar. On the other hand, we're talking about a very different system of expenditure. Back then, you didn't have these third-party layers from contractor to contractor to contractor to contractor, and that's where the money went. The money back then was going straight from the US government to the person building whatever in Europe. Today in Afghanistan, the money goes from hand to hand to hand to hand. And there are people here who have worked in the Afghan government who know exactly what I'm talking about. So it's a very different system, and I don't think we should compare apples and oranges.
Let's just get a quick response, and then we'll get some more questions. Yeah.
I completely agree with the ambassador that it's a different system. But first of all, I ask you to really look at the amount of aid that was spent. It's $150 billion in real dollars, and we spent $90 billion on security, just on the security forces. So it's about $240 billion between the aid and the security. At least that's the data that I have.
Okay. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to take 2 questions here, and then we're going to go over to this side. So first of all, there, and then behind you. Yeah.
Okay. I'm Raymond Whitaker. I'm the editor of Asian Affairs. Been to Afghanistan several times, starting in 1992. I wanted to ask Professor Johnson, you've been very eloquent about all the failures of the US and NATO in Afghanistan. Can you tell us what role they should be playing there? I didn't quite get that from your talk.
So you call for a new strategy. What should it be?
Yeah, well, it's got to be a political strategy. I mean, the Taliban have been very clear from day one that they would never enter reconciliation talks or peace talks until international forces left. I think that regional interlopers have to get out of the country. Now, this is actually a very long conversation, but I'll tell you what I think the ultimate solution for Afghanistan is. I think that it has to be, I think that what we eventually need to do, and it's got to be UN brokered and possibly NATO involved too, and this is going to make many people squirmish in this room, but it's the only one that I can come up with. I think that we should have an explicit, very strong plan to bring parts of the Taliban into the Afghan government. And initially, I think that we should separate the country with the Taliban administering south of the Helmand River and Kabul administering everything north. But every year, that gets smaller and smaller, and we have firm arrangements for eventually a merger to take place. If we've seen one thing since World War II, it's been that when radicals have had to administer, they become more moderate. Now, let me tell you why I think that this plan makes some sense to me. Having the Taliban administer, at least initially, south of Helmand River, they'll be out in the presence. If they're doing nefarious things, we'll be able to take care of them very easily because they're going to be out in the open. And I think the only way that this type of solution could work, now this is actually hours of conversation, is that we also go to Pakistan and we go to other interlopers and we put our thumb down and say, there's no way we're going to allow you to be able to disrupt this. If you do, you're going to be met with a full force, either economically or otherwise, by the United States. But I think Afghans, in my experience, I first went to Afghanistan in 1986. They're very pragmatic people. And I see no military solution. I see a political solution, and I think that we're initially going to have to divide the country, but have it done in such a way that it merges over a 5, 7, 10-year period with set goals in place.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Colonel Nadeem. I'm the Army Advisor from Pakistan High Commission. My question is for Dr. And Ambassador yourself, sir. But before that, I'd like to make a comment that, as it is said that past 2001, we have been receiving about $14 billion or so in the economic aid, and I would say that it is no favor done, because we have had 6,000 army personnel who have laid down their life when none of the 9/11 hijacker was from Pakistan, or the war was not ours. We have lost 78,000 people in the last 16 years in Pakistan. We have lost about $123 billion to our economy. It is no favor. And by the way, for the record purpose, I would like to say that in last 17 years, Pakistan has rendered 2 million, I repeat, 2 million overflights for NATO and American forces, and free of cost ground, air, and sea corridor for supporting the forces in Afghanistan. So it is no favor, sir. Coming over to the question from the ambassador. In order to reduce this blame game, Excellency, there is a requirement to create a pull and push factor in Afghanistan, where almost 2.7 or 2.8 million Afghan refugees who are residing in Pakistan. There is a requirement to create an economic incentive whereby they can be respectfully pushed back to Afghanistan, so that this blame game business on each other can be finished. I think that is a doable thing, where Pakistan is not blamed that Haqqanis or any other person is residing, and we do not blame Afghanistan that the TTP and its leadership is in Afghanistan. So we manage our houses and put this in place. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. And with the microphone, if you go right over to the other side.
Can I quickly respond to him?
Of course you can, yeah. And then the ambassador.
Yeah, I want to quickly respond. Over the last 7 years, Pakistan has been committing explicit acts of war against Afghanistan. In September alone, you shot 1,500 artillery shells into the Kunar in 3 different districts. 2 weeks ago, you shot, in a 3-day period, 400 artillery shells into a sovereign country. These are explicit acts of war that should have been brought up before the United Nations. And this has been going on for 7 years. How do you explain that? Sure.
Okay, tell you what, why don't you just hold on to it for a second while we get the microphone. Can you get the microphone back there? Ambassador, why don't you comment on the second point made?
Okay, before I answer that point, I just want to say that any ideas and any plans or schemes to think that you can divide Afghanistan into Taliban territory and non-Taliban territory is a non-starter, and it will not resolve any issue. What it will do is it's going to create a Talibanistan. And that is exactly what the enemies of Afghanistan want. They first want to divide Afghanistan into what they already, remember in the 90s, they started calling parts of Afghanistan Northern Alliance, which was never the case. This is not an official name of any group. They used to have their own name. This was to create this mentality that there's a North and South Afghanistan, that there is a Pashtun and non-Pashtun Afghanistan, that is a divided nation, that is a nation of ethnicities that are at each other's throats. That is not the case, and I think the Afghan people have proven it, and they're going to continue proving it. Either the Taliban come and become Afghan citizens, or people are going to fight them, and continue to fight them.
What I'm going to do is just let you respond to what's been said about Pakistan, and then we're going to go to this gentleman here in the front row. So, you don't speak, fine. So can we get the microphone?
Yeah, sorry, can I answer him quickly? Yeah, the blame game, pull, push, repatriation of the Afghan. Listen, 3.5 million Afghans have come back from Pakistan alone over the last 16 years. About 1 million have made both Pakistan and Afghanistan their home, so they go back and forth. That border, which we consider as a colonial border. So the colonial border that was drawn obviously is an open border. Whether they build fences in one part or another, it is not going to solve the problem of terrorism and these non-state actors that keep crossing back and forth. While you let those people cross back and forth, you stop civilians, peaceful civilians, from crossing back and forth, which is a proof of duplicity, a proof of double games that is being played. And what we are asking of Pakistan to do is, on one hand, to treat the refugees, the remainder of the refugees, who one day hopefully will come back, who one day will decide. Under international law, they have to voluntarily agree to come back to their country. We as the Afghan government, or the Afghan government, whoever it is, will have to make the arrangements. The UNHCR has to be the brokering intermediary, and the Pakistani government has to make sure that they do return. But to mix the issue of refugees and the Haqqanis is a bogus issue, because the Haqqanis are a known entity, a terrorist organization, a violent group of individuals who are protected by the Pakistani establishment. Everyone knows it, everyone says it clearly, and it's Pakistan's duty and responsibility to either shut down the Haqqanis or to pay the price that has to be paid because of what they are doing to the Afghan people on a daily basis. And then to shift the Haqqanis into new areas, to move them from one location to another, to relabel them, is not going to solve the problem. So all of these things are happening as we are speaking, and all of these things are being monitored and verified. So as long as we do not have a verification system on how to deal with terrorism, we are not going to make any progress. And that, in my opinion, is to the detriment of Pakistan itself.
Okay, thank you.
I hate to be bearer of good news to the Pakistani government official. A guy called Khalid, the mastermind of 9/11, was a Pakistani born in Kuwait. And he was found hiding in a military compound in Rawalpindi. And of course, the great man, the founder of Al-Qaeda, was found hiding in a Pakistani compound, in a military compound, for God's sake. I think people should be ashamed of these types of sort of crocodile tears. I want to take some of the issues highlighted by Professor Johnson, actually.
If you'd ask a question, yeah.
It is a question, but I think you need to understand how I'm framing it. I feel sorry for Pakistan, West Pakistan actually, as it was until 1971, because Punjab itself is a landlocked entity which the British gifted to West Pakistan. And Punjabis have become the landowners of the entire region of West Pakistan. Now they're landlocked. The only people who they can rely upon are the tribes, Pathan tribes. Pathan tribes who now say they're not Pathans because the Indians call them Pathan, they're actually Pashtuns. So they're dependent on the Pathans to continue surviving as a nation state, right? That's why they need to protect their entity in Balochistan and Sindh. The point is, I feel sorry for this because Punjabis are nothing, Punjabi Muslims are nothing without the Pashtuns, right? Yeah. So their survival depends on keeping Afghanistan destabilized. Americans should have known this for decades. The fact is, thousands of Americans and Brits died despite the fact that Americans actually and Brits funded them. The point is, Pakistan, Punjab cannot survive as a nation as long as these regions are in conflict.
Thank you very much. I'm going to cut you there. There's no question. I will no, if you can pass it to the back to the gentleman in the blue shirt. There is question. Questions appreciated.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. If you would allow me to comment a bit, because I'm an Afghan journalist. I'm coming from Afghanistan, and I lived all my life, like 27 years. I have been in Kandahar in south of Afghanistan, in Helmand, and recently I have the privilege to be in Pakistan because I wanted to do a documentary on the demographic changes about Pashtuns in North and Waziristan. I may not take a lot of time off here, just I may tell some of the things, which is the current...
We're really not here to hear your research. I'm sorry. If you've got questions which you'd like to put to the panel...
No, that's not my research. Okay. That's what Afghans are thinking. I think one of the key things we are missing from the beginning till end, that almost we are at the end, we are missing two narratives. The Pakistani narrative when it comes to US policy, and also the Afghan narratives in Kabul, and the technicality of the changes in war against terror and Taliban. I would just not take 2 minutes off. In Pakistan, I think the US policy was unexpected, shockable, and it was out of the calculations of the military establishment, because their primary calculation was that President Trump might be fully withdrawal of the American forces in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, I think it was so promising against what Professor Thompson has projected pessimism within the society. Firstly, I think it was about the psychology of the war in Afghanistan. Taliban has realized that there is no time limit for presence of the United States in Afghanistan. Secondly, there is no even a small window for them to win the militarily Afghanistan war. And secondly, what was so promising in the technical level, at the moment there is a new moral within the Afghan forces. As Dawood mentioned here, B-52 is coming back. They have attacked Helmand provinces, the narcotics factories of the Taliban, which is almost 80% the financial resources of the Taliban. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. There's I hope a question down here on the front row. Okay, got you.
Lakul Lohana from Birds in the Congress. My question to Professor Johnson is that you said very good remark that the Afghanistan couldn't be solved without solving Pakistan. Before we knew, before the researchers like you knew what is the role of Pakistan, the intelligence agencies in USA should have known it long time ago, and now it is very much clear without any doubt. I want to ask the question, what are the inherent issues within the policy circles of USA that is stopping to take the decisive policy on Pakistan?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
No, because now it is very much clear, without any doubt, the role of Pakistan. But before you and I knew, the intelligence agencies in USA, they knew it much before than that. What is the role of Pakistan? And Pakistan's role was not of a friend, of an enemy. This is known. Now, what is inherent issues within the USA policy? What are the issues inherent that is stopping USA to take a decisive action? And so, I mean, of course, a very complex situation, but